Welcome back, everybody. Today we're diving into a couple of true crime stories that, at first glance seem totally different, but stick with us. There's some really interesting connections between them.
Yeah, what really gets me about these cases is they kind of show just how fragile life is, like how quickly things can go from totally normal to like absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, exactly. And they both have these crazy twists and turns that'll make you question like everything you thought you knew.
Hmm.
So first up, we're going to the mountains of North Carolina. Back in 1972, picture a quiet, snowy evening. Suddenly a horrible discovery. That's what happened to the Durham family, Bryce, Virginia, and their son, Bobby Joe. They were found murdered in their bathtub.
It's a scene straight out of like a classic whodunit. You know, you've got the picture perfect family, a brutal crime, and the whole community's left in shock trying to figure out what happened.
And get this, for decades, nobody knew.
Hmm.
The cops first thought it was a robbery, right? I mean, there were signs of a struggle. The house was a mess.
But there were also some things that just didn't add up. Like the police found this envelope full of cash just sitting there, untouched. And the family's car was abandoned, like down an embankment, but with a pillowcase full of silver still inside. And an irregular robber wouldn't leave that stuff behind, right?
It's almost like whoever did this wanted it to look like a robbery.
Hmm.
So if it wasn't just some random burglary, then who could it be? Well, people started looking at the son-in-law, Troy Hall. He was the one who called the police. He said Virginia had called him all panicked, saying 3 guys were attacking the family.
But his story, when you really look at it, it's full of holes. Like, why did he wait so long to call the cops? And why did he leave his wife alone in the car while he was supposedly checking out this dangerous situation? And maybe the most suspicious thing, the Durhams apparently didn't even like Tria very much.
It's one of those things where you immediately think, okay, this guy's definitely hiding something.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, even with all these red flags, they never officially said Troy was a suspect. The case went cold for 40 years. Can you imagine that? A whole generation grows up with this unsolved mystery hanging over their town.
It really shows how powerful these cases can be, the way they capture people's attention and just won't let go. We're drawn to the mystery, the search for answers. We want to make sense of something that just doesn't make sense.
Then in 2022, when everyone had given up hope, boom, a
Yeah.
total bombshell. A guy comes forward and says his dad confessed to the murders on his deathbed. Apparently, his dad was part of the Dixie Mafia. He said his father and 3 other guys were hired to kill the Durhams.
This totally changed everything. Suddenly, this small town tragedy was linked to this huge criminal organization operating in the shadows.
Talk about a twist. So after 4 decades, they finally figured out who killed the Durhams. But that's not the end of the story, is it?
No, it's not, because the biggest question is still unanswered. Who ordered the hit and why? This new information just opened up a whole new set of questions. Even more intrigue and unanswered questions that are still haunting this case.
It just shows you that sometimes even when you think you have all the pieces, the puzzle's not finished.
And it really highlights how complicated truth can be. It can be hidden beneath like layers of lies, misdirection, and just the fact that so much time has passed.
Okay, so now let's switch gears completely. We're going back to 1961. Instead of a snowy mountain town, picture this. The crystal clear waters of the Bahamas. A family on their dream vacation. They're sailing on a boat called the Bluebell. Sounds perfect, right?
It definitely seemed that way at first. 11-year-old Terry Jo Dupereau, her parents, her brother and sister, and they hired this captain, Julian Harvey. They set sail for what they thought would be an amazing adventure.
And the first part of the trip was like paradise. The family was snorkeling, exploring deserted beaches, collecting seashells. They loved the Bahamas so much that they decided to stay longer. But they had no idea that beneath this perfect surface, a storm was brewing. A darkness that would change their lives forever.
What's so creepy about this case is that the danger wasn't something out there, some unpredictable thing like a storm. It was right there on the boat, in the form of this seemingly charming and experienced Captain Harvey.
And that's what makes it so scary. We always talk about trusting your gut, being careful around strangers.
Yeah.
But what do you do when someone seems totally trustworthy? Someone you've literally trusted with your family's safety?
It's a chilling reminder that evil can often hide behind a mask of normalcy, like looking respectable. And I think we all struggle with that on some level, that feeling of being vulnerable, not knowing who to trust.
Right. It makes you realize that even in paradise, danger can be lurking just below the surface.
Hmm.
But back to the story. So the family's enjoying their vacation, totally clueless about the darkness inside Captain Harvey. Then one night, everything changes.
Terry Jo wakes up to this terrifying sound. There's commotion on the deck. Her brother's screaming. It's like this moment that shatters the peace and joy of the trip, a sudden plunge into chaos and fear.
Her heart's racing. She carefully goes to the main cabin, and what she sees there will stay with her forever. Her mother and brother are lying in a pool of blood.
Can you imagine the terror, the confusion, an 11-year-old girl seeing that? It's just a brutal reminder of how fragile life is, how innocence can be shattered in a second.
And the horror doesn't stop there. She comes face to face with Captain Harvey, and he's strangely calm. He hands her a rope attached to a life raft and tells her to hold on. But she's in shock and terrified. She drops the rope. The raft drifts away.
Oh man, that's a heart-stopping moment, a desperate fight for survival. The boat's sinking, her family's gone, and she's trapped with a murderer. It's almost too much.
But Terry Jo's instincts kick in. She remembers there's a small cork life raft on the boat, and she grabs it just as the Bluebell sinks beneath the waves. Now she's alone on this tiny raft, adrift in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, facing this impossible challenge. Not just the physical challenge of surviving, but the mental trauma of what she just saw.
It really shows the incredible resilience of the human spirit, especially when faced with such unimaginable trauma. Here she is, an 11-year-old girl, completely alone, having to deal with the forces of nature, the haunting memory of what happened, and the terrifying possibility that Captain Harvey's still out there somewhere.
And her ordeal is just beginning. So picture this Terry Jo's on this tiny raft, the ocean's all around her, and she's still dealing with the memory of that horrific night. Could you even begin to imagine what she must have been going through, physically and emotionally?
It's mind-blowing, honestly. You've got the sun beating down the threat of dehydration, the constant waves, and then you've got the mental side of it, the trauma, the grief being all alone. It's a true testament to the human spirit that she survived for 4 days and nights.
4 days. It's hard enough to imagine surviving a few hours lost at sea, let alone days.
Yeah.
What do you think kept her going?
Well, from what I've read, it was a combination of things. There were times when she was just purely determined, refusing to give up. And then there were these glimmers of hope. Like when she saw a plane flying overhead, she tried to signal it with her shirt.
Oh, man, that must have been so frustrating. To be that close to rescue and then see it fly away.
Exactly. But there were also these moments where she almost had a spiritual connection with nature. Like one day she was surrounded by a pod of dolphins swimming right alongside her raft.
Wow, that's incredible. You hear stories about dolphins protecting swimmers from sharks, but this sounds like they were comforting her, giving her company when she needed it most.
It's a beautiful image, isn't it? And I think it points to something deeper about nature, how it can both challenge us and comfort us. Even in the middle of this horrible experience, Terry Jo found moments of peace and beauty, looking at the stars, being amazed by the glowing plankton in the water.
It reminds you that even in the darkest times, there's still beauty to be found if you're open to it. But it couldn't have all been dolphins and stars. What about the physical challenges? How did she stay alive for so long?
Well, she was resourceful. She found a little sponge on the raft and used it to collect rainwater, which helped with the dehydration. But there were times when her body was pushed to the limit. She was badly sunburned, hungry, exhausted. At one point, she even started hallucinating. She saw mirages of islands that disappeared as she got closer.
Man, that must have been such a roller coaster. The hope and then the crushing disappointment of realizing it wasn't real. It makes you wonder how much the human mind can take before it just breaks.
It really shows her mental toughness. She was determined to survive to see her father again. And that willpower, that belief that she would be reunited with her family, seems to have been what got her through the worst of it.
And then on the 4th day, just when she was about to give up, something amazing happened. A Greek freighter, like out of nowhere, spotted her tiny raft in the vast ocean.
It's incredible. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Imagine the relief, the disbelief, the overwhelming joy she must have felt when those sailors pulled her aboard.
It's one of those stories that makes you believe in humanity again. In kindness and compassion, even when you least expect it. But while Terry Jo's ordeal was finally over, the story takes another dark turn.
Right. Captain Harvey, remember, he'd been rescued the day before with the body of Terry Jo's younger sister, Renee. He made up this whole story about a sudden storm sinking the boat and claimed he did everything he could to save the family.
So he was trying to make everyone think he was the hero, the poor survivor.
Exactly. And for a while, it seemed like people believed him. But then the news came out that Terry Jo was alive and his whole story fell apart.
Wow, so he was about to get caught.
Yeah, and when he realized his lies were going to be exposed, Harvey killed himself in a hotel room.
That's a chilling ending to an already disturbing story. But it also leaves you with so many questions. What actually happened on that boat? What made Harvey do something so horrible?
Yeah, those questions lingered for years. But as investigators looked into Harvey's past, they found a disturbing pattern. Turns out he had a history of suspicious deaths connected to his former wives, and it usually involved insurance money.
So this wasn't some random act of violence. This was a calculated, cold-blooded killer.
That's what it looks like. It seems like Captain Harvey, this charming, experienced sailor, was actually a predator who used his charisma to lure unsuspecting victims.
That's a terrifying thought.
Hmm.
And for Terry Jo to survive this horrific experience, only to find out the truth about this man who she trusted, who was supposed to protect her.
It's unimaginable. It adds a whole other layer of trauma to the story. The betrayal, the shattered trust that she had to deal with on top of everything else.
It makes her story of survival even more incredible. She didn't just survive those 4 days lost at sea, but she also had to cope with the emotional and psychological damage of Harvey's lies.
And that brings up a really important point, the long-term impact of trauma. We often focus on the immediate aftermath, surviving, physically finding justice. But what about the scars? You can't see the emotional wounds that can last for years or even decades.
That's so true.
Mhm.
Terry Jo's story isn't just about surviving the ocean. It's about navigating the long and difficult process of healing from trauma.
Exactly. And her story, in a lot of ways, reflects how our society is changing the way we think about and deal with trauma. For a long time, there was this stigma around talking about mental health, about emotional pain.
People were just expected to get over it, to bury their feelings and move on.
Right. But now we're starting to realize how harmful that can be. Trauma doesn't just go away because you ignore it. It can come out in all kinds of ways: anxiety, depression, PTSD, even physical problems.
So how did Terry Jo handle the trauma she went through? Did she get help?
Well, at first, like many survivors, she pushed her memories down, she tried to move on with her life, and she did to a remarkable degree. But those buried emotions eventually came to the surface.
It's like the ocean itself. Even when it looks calm, there can be powerful currents underneath.
Exactly. And for Terry Jo, those currents eventually brought her back to that night, forcing her to confront the pain she tried to escape.
So what happened? Did she finally reach out for help?
She did. Years later, she started seeing a therapist, and that's when her real healing journey began. Through therapy, she was able to process her grief, deal with the trauma, and take back control of her story.
It's a good reminder that it's never too late to ask for help to face the past and start healing. But there's another fascinating part of Terry Jo's story that I think is worth talking about. You're saying that Terry Jo found this unique way to connect with her past. Like she turned her trauma into something that gave her strength.
Yeah, and it's such a powerful detail. She actually worked as a water management specialist for 14 years for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Think about that. The same thing that almost took her life, that holds the memory of such a terrible loss that became her life's work.
It's like she was taking back the ocean, turning it from something scary into something that could heal her and give her purpose.
Exactly. And it's an example of something called post-traumatic growth. It's where people who've gone through trauma don't just cope, but they actually grow and change from the experience.
So it's not just about going back to who you were before the trauma, but actually coming out of it as a different person.
Right. It's about finding new meaning, new strength, new ways of seeing things that you wouldn't have had without going through that hardship.
It's a powerful reminder that even when things are really bad, there's still a chance for growth, for change.
And Terry Jo's story is a perfect example. She didn't just survive those 4 days lost at sea. She embraced the ocean, she learned from it, and she dedicated her life to protecting it.
It makes you wonder, what if we could all face our own challenges, our own traumas with that same kind of resilience, that same willingness to find meaning and purpose in the middle of it all?
That's a great question. And while we can't erase the pain of the past, maybe we can learn from Terry Jo's example and find ways to turn our wounds into something that makes us stronger and helps us grow.
Okay, so let's go back to the Durham family murders for a minute. We talked about all the twists and turns in the investigation, the shocking discovery of the Dixie Mafia being involved. But I'm curious, what are some of the bigger lessons we can learn from this case, especially for people who are fascinated by true crime, but haven't experienced something like this themselves?
It's important to remember that behind all these fascinating stories, all the headlines and the mysteries, there are real people, real families whose lives have been torn apart by violence and loss.
It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of a case, the puzzle of it all, but we can't forget the human cost.
Absolutely. And the Durham case really shows us how violence has a ripple effect, how it affects not just the victims, but the whole community. The town of Boone lived with this unsolved mystery for 40 years.
Can you imagine living with that fear, the suspicion, all those unanswered questions for all that time?
It says a lot about the resilience of that community that they kept going, that they never gave up hope of finding answers. And even though the truth was hard to hear, even though it meant a powerful criminal organization was involved, there was a sense of relief of closure when the secrets finally came out.
It shows the power of truth, even when it's difficult to face. And it reminds us how important justice is holding people accountable no matter how much time has passed.
It also reminds us how complicated these investigations can be. They often involve figuring out a whole mess of motives, alibis, and conflicting evidence. And even though we might want a neat and tidy ending, the truth is that sometimes, even when a case is solved, there are still loose ends questions that never get answered.
Like, who ordered the hit on the Durhams? That might be a secret that stays hidden forever.
And that brings us to an interesting connection between these two stories that seem so different. Both the Durham case and Terry Jo's story show us how hard it can be to find the truth, how time lies, and even our own perceptions can hide it from us.
It's like we're always trying to put together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are always missing.
But even the act of searching can teach us things. Asking questions, challenging what we think we know, digging deeper. That's where the real discoveries are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the main things you hope our listeners will think about? What's the connection between these two stories and their own lives?
I think it comes down to the importance of being resilient, of finding meaning and purpose, even when things are tough. Terry Jo's story is a powerful reminder that we humans are capable of overcoming incredible challenges. And the Durham case shows us how powerful truth is and how important it is to keep searching for justice no matter how long it takes.
These are stories that stay with you, that make you look at the world differently. They remind us that life is precious, that it can change in a second, and that even in the darkest times, there's always hope.
And maybe as you go about your day, you'll start noticing those small acts of courage, the quiet moments of resilience, the subtle ways truth shows up in our lives.
It's been amazing exploring these stories with you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep looking for those extraordinary stories that shape our world.